All right.
We are on YouTube. Hello.
We
YouTube.
are live on YouTube, or at least it says we're live on YouTube. Okay. And we are in fact live on YouTube. And so let me start the webinar. And let's get this party started. Okay, we are live. And people are coming in.
And here they come.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, everybody.
Welcome to the first Sunday lecture. And everyone can admire Michelle's scarf and the beautiful yarns behind her.
They are some incredible yarns.
They are. I have 3 full boxes full of them.
Oh, wow. I know your address too.
Over my dead body, Dawn.
I'm sure.
Over my dead body.
Well, you know, it cost me more to fly out there to figure out a way to crawl in your house than to
There
just
is
buy
that.
the gun.
Well, Dawn, we could fix that.
Right, exactly. I know there's other
There's
ways.
a way for you to have 3 boxes full too.
Yes. I might live in a tent for a year, but
Tents are nice.
you know, I've
I
always
did
said
that one year.
I could probably pull that off.
There you go.
Well, you're in Florida, right? No.
Yeah.
Might
No,
be-
I
might
wouldn't
be-
do it here.
Okay, good. Not there, but
No,
Yeah.
Montana.
Here you could live for a tent in a year.
Southern California, please. Thank
Okay,
you.
Southern California. Fine.
Yeah.
How big are the boxes, Tian?
They're pretty big boxes. They're like they're not the well, if I gesture you won't be able to see it. They're like the half the size of those big under the bed boxes.
Wow.
So they're about this tall by about I think 17 or 18 inches wide by about 30 inches deep. So they're pretty big boxes. I got a lot of cones.
A lot of cones.
So anyway, shall we go ahead and get started?
Sounds good.
Dawn, do you want to do the spiel?
All righty. So we have a giant lesson today, and we will take questions and answers if we can at the end, or we will save your questions and answers from today and do them on Wednesday's session. We'll use the Q&A interface for questions, and that's at the bottom of your screen if you're on a desktop or laptop, somewhere on the top of your screen if you're on a device maybe. 2 little thought bubbles. So when you click that, you can type your question in, and I will be scanning questions and trying to group them together. You can help me by using the thumbs up button. If you see somebody else's asked the same question that you'd like to hear an answer to, thumbs up it. And that way I can ask the questions that everybody wants to hear about. Please, please, please don't ask questions in the chat. We won't be able to keep up with that. And again, I think we're going to hear a lot from Tian today, so we will do what we can with questions. I think that's everything.
Yes. One thing is that we will specifically not be answering color editor questions today because we're having an entire session Q&A about the color editor tomorrow with our wonderful Dawn.
With me.
So we're explicitly not answering any questions about the color editor or the gradients editor today. Also because we've got a bazillion things to cover today because we released 45 lessons on Friday. Okay, so actually, Michelle, we were going to answer one question, but I think I'm actually going to dive straight into the live lecture.
Off you go. Okay.
So, because we have a lot of lessons to cover.
Oh,
So just to talk a little bit about the format, I'm going to start by talking about the overview, what's a gradient, and then I'm going to talk about some commonalities, some basic principles of gradient design that are common to all the 4 types of gradients. And then I'm going to walk through all 4 types of gradients. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the differences between plane weave and twill. And at that point, I'm going to take questions if we've got time left over. And I'm going to do that in that format because I want to make sure that we actually get through everything, because we've basically got an hour and a half to cover a lot of ground. So if it turns out that we have more time than I think we do, then might take some questions in between, but only questions that are related to that particular section. So let's see how things go. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and get started. And screen 2. And let's get this Zoom thing off the screen. And so, okay, so let's get started with gradient concepts. And so the first question, of course, is what is actually a gradient? So a gradient is basically a transition between colors. And you start with one color on one side and you finish with the other color on the other side. And there's basically two ways of doing this. You can either do a gradual transition by blending a color with another color. And that's the 2-color gradient that I'm talking about here. And this is an optical mixing idea. So here you're starting with color 1 and you're gradually blending in more and more of color 2 until you have transitioned to color 2. How well this works depends in part on how close together those 2 colors are. In the case of this thing that's currently on the screen, at the top of my screen, this works pretty well because orange and red are very similar colors. If you are looking at this image here with the purple and yellow, this doesn't work so well because purple and yellow are not very similar colors. And because this effect also depends on this thing called optical mixing, where the eye blends together colors that are similar, blends together dots of color that are too small to see distinctly. As your dots of color get bigger and bigger, the eye blends them together less and less, which is why on the right side, the gradient looks choppier and the eye is not blending the colors together quite so well. So I'll talk about this a little bit more when I talk about the principles of gradient design. But basically, the 2-color gradient relies on the eye mixing the colors together. And it only works with 2 colors because you're only alternating 2 colors together. So then with multicolor gradients, you are using the transition of colors and you're using stripes of solid color. What this relies on is using stripes of colors that are very close to each other to create the gradual transition. And basically, you can either use stripes of solid color yarn, or you can use a yarn that is gradation dyed to create essentially an infinite number of stripes of colors that are very close to each other. And so those are basically the 2 ways you do a gradient. One is by visually blending 2 colors together to create a transition. And the other is by putting stripes of color that are very similar to each other to create the transition. Now, in order to construct the gradient with 2-color gradients, I talked about this earlier, but basically here you have the alternating thread gradient. This is a linear gradient with groups of 2 threads. And there are actually an infinite number of ways of doing alternate thread gradients. The 3 that we're doing in this class are the linear gradient, the curved gradient, and the Fibonacci fade. And we're going into those obviously in depth later. But the idea of the alternating thread gradient is basically that you take once again, that you take version, let me do a gradient. Okay, hide image. The idea of the alternating thread gradient is basically that you take one color and another color, and you just alternate them. and you're alternating them either at a very small size scale, or you can do them in in thicker threads. And if you're doing it in thicker threads, then they don't blend together as closely. I don't know how well this will work on your screen, but at a larger scale, the blending is less complete than at a smaller scale. And if you use if you use threads that have more contrast, then the blending is less complete than if you use colors that are closer together. So that's the basic idea behind the alternating thread gradient. Now, bundled thread gradients are created by basically taking multiple strands of a single yarn and of a thin yarn and bundling them together and basically it's like creating plies almost of a thicker yarn. It's almost like twisting together multiple multiple strands of a single yarn to create a thicker plied yarn, except that you're not twisting them together. And so if you take a close look at this picture, let's see if I can zoom in on it. You can see that in the center of this picture, there is a yarn that is made up out of 3 strands, I think, of a yellow yarn and an orange yarn, and that this is giving it a kind of speckled look in the center. And so that's a bundled yarn. And I believe that she has also done a slightly bundled effect in the row above, but it's not as obvious. I think she told me that she had done it, but because the colors are very close together, it's really not as obvious. Now, I have another example, which is on a rigid heddle loom, which I think I have. Here we go. So this is another bundled thread gradient, which if I increase the size, let's zoom in. You can see if I really zoom in that here you have several threads of, you can see that here you have 2 threads of, so right here where my pointer is, there are 2 threads of purple and 1 thread of red. And then you go to a little further over and you have 2 threads of red and 1 thread of purple. And here you also have 2 threads of red and 1 thread of purple. And there's this forms a stripe that is part red and part purple. And then you get over here and it's pure red. And so this forms a transition from this stripe over here of pure purple over to a stripe of pure red. And so that creates a gradient in between. So that's the bundled thread gradient. Now, how smooth that transition is depends on how close the colors are together. In this particular case, the purple and the red are fairly close together in value, which is the lightness or darkness of a color. And so they blend together pretty well. In this particular case, the red and the yellow are fairly different in value. The red is medium darkness and the yellow is quite light. And so if you look at how the bundled thread gradient works, it's a little more obvious that you're blending 2 colors that are different. But if you think about what it would be like if you put that red next to the yellow immediately, you can see that the stripe would be a huge jump if you put the red just next to the yellow, whereas you're getting a much more gradual transition by using the bundled thread gradient. So it doesn't give you a totally smooth gradient, but it gives you a much smoother gradient than if you just put the stripes side by side. So that's the other way of creating a two color gradient. Now, if you want to create a multicolor gradient, there are 2 ways of doing it. One is to do the striped gradient that we talked about earlier. And this is using colors next to each other that are similar. And so that creates a smooth gradient. And so by putting the purple, which is similar to the blue, next to the blue green, which is similar to the blue, next to the green and the lime green and the yellow, you get a smooth gradient because every color that is next to another color is similar to its neighbor. Now, the more different the colors are, the choppier your gradient gets. And so if you look here at the one underneath it, this one looks kind of choppy because the difference between, say, yellow and yellow-orange is actually pretty substantial. So the problem with getting a smooth gradient using a striped gradient method is that you need a lot of colors or else a fairly narrow color range in order to get a really smooth gradient. And I think later on I have the example of that 28 color of those 28 colors that I hand dyed to get a very super smooth gradient using stripes. And then the other way to do the multicolor gradient is to use gradation dyeing. And so you can use hand dyed yarns to get a pretty smooth gradient without having to go through a whole lot of contortions. And so you dye the warp or the weft yarn in a gradient before you weave it, and then you use it as a continuous yarn. And so here's a really nice example. This yarn was, I think, it wasn't injection dyed. I think what the dyer did was take a ball of yarn and throw it into a pot of dye. And so the outside dyed very dark, and then it dyed progressively lighter and lighter on the inside as the dye didn't penetrate all the way to the inside. But of course, when you weave it up, that it didn't dye quite evenly. So when you weave it up, you get that lovely gradation from dark on the outside to light on the inside, but with variegation. This particular one was done with a knitted blank, which is a particular dyeing technique that I won't get into, but it creates a very smooth gradient from yellow to orange to brown, to kind of a brownish orange. And you could also do from any color you want to any other color. Now, the downside of using the dyed gradient is that you are at the mercy of the dyer. So if the dyer decided to do one particular color sequence, that's what you're stuck with. You can break the yarn if you have an area of solid color to shorten that area of solid color, but that's really about all you can do to change the gradient. So it's not included in this class, partly because you don't have any dyed gradient yarn, but also because it's design-wise, it is relatively simple and also relatively limited. And then the last thing you can do is combine gradient techniques. So if you want to create a striped gradient particularly, and you want to smooth the transition between the stripes, the easiest way to do it is to put a 2-color gradient between the adjacent stripes. And usually what you do is you put a linear gradient between the 2 stripes, because the linear gradient is what is the best way to achieve a smooth gradient that doesn't call attention to itself. So again, here is your striped gradient that covers the rainbow. And here's the striped gradient with alternating thread gradient between each of the borders. The upside of doing that, of course, is that you get this super smooth gradient between the different stripes. The downside is that the linear gradient is much fussier to warp because you don't have even stripes, or you don't have an even thread count. And so the one on the bottom is much fussier to warp than the one on top. So that is the basic of what's a gradient and how you make a gradient. Now I'm going to dive into a couple of basic gradient design principles. So one of them is talking a little bit about smooth gradients and bold gradients and gradient design. So I'm going to jump ahead just a little bit to the linear gradients. And so smooth linear gradients versus dramatic and bold gradients. So here I'll loop back around to linear gradients in general, but I wanted to show some of the images here. So if you want a smooth gradient with a seamless transition between colors, you want to use colors with very little contrast. And if you want a bold gradient, you want colors that contrast strongly with each other. And you want more threads in each stripe, and you want thicker threads. And the difference is in what kind of, where you want to focus attention in your pattern. So if you want people to be looking at the pattern of colors as opposed to the pattern of lines, here you're looking at the pattern of lines. And here you're looking at the pattern of colors, the transition between the green, the yellow, and the orange. And you're not looking at the lines because the line pattern is really subtle. And so if you want to use the pattern of lines as your main design, then you want to have high contrast. And one of the subtle points between the different types of gradients is that curved gradients emphasize the lines in general. So backing up to here and talking about gradient styles, the linear gradient can be about the lines. So if you scroll down to here, this is designing with a gradient that is about seeing the lines of the gradient. And the curved gradient, this again is about seeing the curved pattern and making it about the curved pattern. This is more about the colors. This is about both color and pattern, because you're seeing the pattern of the lines, but you're also seeing the progression of colors. So when you're designing, and this is not strictly about gradients, but I'll go into it anyway, because I think it's important to think about when you're designing your cowl. You want to think about whether you're looking at the pattern of lines or whether you're looking at the pattern of colors, or both. And the higher the contrast between the lines, then the more you'll look at the pattern of lines. The lower the contrast between the side-by-side lines, the more you'll be looking at the colors. So in this particular case, there's not much contrast between the adjacent lines. And so you're more looking at the pattern of the colors. With the linear gradient up top here, there's almost no contrast between adjacent colors. And so you're really looking and so the lines really don't show. You're really looking at the sequence of the colors. So that's something to keep in mind. And the way to control whether you're looking at the colors or the lines of the design is through contrast. And so that is what I'm about to talk about. We're going to talk more about that, actually, a lot more next week. But in the interim, so basically contrast, this is a lesson out of my class, Make Your Colors Sing. But basically contrast, there are two elements of contrast. And one of them is value contrast, which we talk about actually in the linear gradients lesson. But I've got some great pictures here. So this has strong value contrast in black and white. This has less value contrast. And then this has very low value contrast. And you can see the pattern very strongly in this one because of the high value contrast, less strongly in this one, and very little in this one. And if you go back to the linear gradients, here we go. This corresponds to, let's see, did I have an example? I don't have an example in here. So if you want that bold contrast, let's go back to this lesson. So this is an example of how value contrast makes your pattern show. And let me go in, and then as far as hue contrast goes in cloth generally, the more hue contrast, the more your pattern will show, but it's not as strong an effect as value contrast. So if you look at this color wheel here, magenta and green are on opposite sides of the color wheel. So here's green over here, and here's magenta on the opposite side. And if you put them together, you get fabric with very strong hue contrast. If you take magenta here and this kind of bluish color over here, they're pretty close to each other and they have much lower hue contrast. And as a result, you wind up with fabric that doesn't contrast as strongly. Now, if you were to take that and put it into a color gradient, let's grab a twill. What this means is that if you were to do a gradient in, let's grab a magenta, hold on a minute. So if I were to do a magenta, and let's grab a green, and let's grab a blue here. Okay. So if I were, what this means is that if I were to do a gradient, warp and do a linear gradient, and if I were to do it in magenta and green, like this, and click Save Colors, this would give me a gradient with some contrast. And actually, let me do it this way. Let me do two gradients. So let's size this up. And I'll do a gradient over half this. Linear. Save colors. And then I'll do another gradient over the other half. Just so you can compare them. So now we'll do a gradient in these two colors, which are much more similar. And we'll do a linear. Okay. That's the same. So there we go. And you can see that the two colors that are more similar don't produce as much contrast as the ones that are further apart on the color wheel. And so that's one part of contrast. If I were to take this magenta and this green on the left-hand side, which are almost exactly the same value, and if I were to change that green to a much darker green to add more value contrast, then all of a sudden I would have a much more visible gradient. So that shows you that value contrast is more important than hue contrast, and also that value contrast is the most important thing. If I were to take that green and darken it up even further, then the gradient would be even more obvious. And now the other thing to keep in mind is that the scale of the gradient also matters. And for rigid heddle loom weavers, that actually turns out to be really important. If I were to show you this in plain weave, so if we were looking at, let me clear out this gradient actually. So one of the things about rigid heddle weaving, Lorraine was saying high contrast. Did I mean value or value and hue? Contrast matters in value and value and hue, but value matters more. So it's more important that something be high contrast in black and white than that it be high contrast around the color wheel. So rigid heddle designs in plane weave tend to have choppier gradients because they use thicker threads. So let me show you why, because let's do some gradients. If we have this gradient here, and let's do this one in 2 colors that have moderate that have actually quite a bit of contrast. If we do a linear gradient of some scale. Okay. Now this one has a fair amount of value contrast between the colors. Actually, let's make it higher contrast. And if you make this a really small design, then it tends to blend together more than if you make it really big. And so one of the principles of gradients is that if you have thick threads, or of color blending generally, is that thick threads will blend together color-wise less than thin threads. And what that means is that for rigid heddle weavers, you will tend to get less color blending. Where is my example? You'll tend to get less color blending in rigid heddle pieces than you will in pieces that are woven from, for example, let's see, here we go. Than you will from pieces that are woven in finer yarns. So this is 3-2 cotton. And because it's woven in 3-2 cotton, which is a relatively heavy yarn, you can see the intersections of the individual yarns a lot more clearly than you would in a piece that was woven with, say, 10-2 cotton, where the individual yarn intersections are much less visible. This is actually a twill. Let me see if I can pull up a plain. I think this is plain weave. Hold on. So this is plain weave in 10-2 cotton, and you can see that the intersections, this is probably about the same magnification, but you can see that the colors are blending a lot more closely in the 10-2 cotton than in the 3-2 cotton. So one of the things to think about when you're designing gradients for the rigid heddle is ways that you can blend colors more closely. And there are a couple ways of doing it. One of them is to use the bundled thread technique that I was talking about earlier. This one where, did I close that? I did. The one where you have multiple threads. Let me see if I can pull that up again. That's going to take me longer to find than is probably worth it. That's the one where I had the red blending with purple and the red blending with yellow. So that's one method to bundle together 3 or 4 strands of yarn into a thicker yarn to blend colors together, and that makes the transitions more blendy. Another approach is to just accept that you're going to get some railroading, and I'll talk about the railroading in a moment. You can get colors that are closer together in color. Now that involves buying more yarns, but if you are doing a gradient that, particularly if you're doing stripes in colors that are very similar to each other, so if you're not going from yellow to straight to green like that, but if you're going from yellow to, to yellow green to this other green to green, then that will give you a much smoother color transition than if you're jumping around the color wheel more. So one thing you might consider would be getting something like the Lunatic Fringe GAMP kits, which with the full set of colors, and that will let you do very smooth color transitions, even if you're weaving with something like 3-2 cotton, which is relatively thick. The other possibility would be to get something like a smaller collection of colors, but to get it in a finer yarn and bundle them together. And then another possibility would be to use a dyed gradient, either getting like mini skeins of either getting yarn that's been dyed in a gradient, which you can get, I think, in either in lace weight or sock yarns, or if you're a dyer, getting a knitted blank of sock yarn and dyeing it yourself, or just buying a gradient dyed yarn. So those are all options if you're using a rigid heddle. Now that gets me to railroading and log cabin. I think some people were interpreting my comments about railroading as you should never use single thread units with plain weave. And that's not actually the case. So one thing is that railroading and log cabin are their effects. So some people like it because it adds interesting texture. Some people don't like it. And so whether you like it or not is basically should guide you on whether or not to do it. In fact, this particular piece that I was using as an example actually looks pretty darn good overall. And so if you actually wear it, it looks spectacular, right? Because there's a saying that my sewing mentor, the one who helped me with my wedding dress, used to say, which is that the guy who is lying on the floor looking at the hem of your dress is probably too drunk to notice. And so if you are zoomed in looking at this piece and looking at the railroading, then yes, you'll see it. I mean, there's some railroading here, and there's some railroading down here, and you've got the log cabin effects going here. But will you see it? It depends on what you're weaving, right? If you're weaving placemats, then somebody might see it and they might decide that it was an interesting design feature, or they might decide that it was a flaw. And whether that's a flaw or not is kind of up to you. Now, if you're actually wearing this cowl, I can tell you that nobody is really going to see or pay attention to the fact that there is railroading going on. So it's up to you whether you think that railroading is going to matter. The other thing is that railroading doesn't always happen. So, and the log cabin isn't always going to happen. Railroading happens when there is value contrast between adjacent warp stripes. Let me clear this out. So actually, let's make this all white. So if there's value contrast between adjacent warp stripes and the weft is the same darkness as your single thread warp stripes. So let me unpack that. So if you have a single thread warp stripe like this, and you have value contrast between that and the adjacent warp. So like here you have black and white and black on either side of it. And you have a weft that is the same darkness. And here you have a black weft. So this satisfies it. Now you can see that you're getting railroading because you have black weft crossing something that has light on either side of it. But if you were to have a white warp, a white weft, for example, you wouldn't get it. You would get dots instead. And if you were to have something that was middle of the road, you would get something sort of in between. Now, and so how much effect you would get really depends on what colors you have in the warp and where they're placed. So I would, before deciding that you can't use single thread warp stripes, I would look at your warp and your weft, your gradients, and decide whether that's really going to be a problem and whether you can live with any railroading that you get. And that's particularly true if you're working with a rigid heddle loom, because if you work with a rigid heddle loom, you will be working with plane weave, and because you're working with thicker threads, going to 2-thread stripes will really make your gradient your gradient stripes very prominent. So it's worth your while to check whether you'll actually get railroading and whether you can live with the railroading that you do get. So let's see. Okay, so that's basically the general principles that I was talking about. Let's talk about the different types of gradients. And so now let's go into linear gradients. So linear gradients in general are the best way to transition smoothly from one color to another. You can also use it for designs just by itself. So if you were to, oh, okay, hold on a minute. Where were we? So, like I said, you can use it to create the primary design as well. And here is a linear double gradient. This is from the Discover Gradients Weave Along, so it may look familiar. Or I don't think I showed this in the Discover Gradients Weave Along because we weren't doing double gradients then. But this is a double gradients on a Discover Gradients Weave Along warp. To construct a linear gradient. So a linear gradient is basically stripes. You can think of it as stripes. Let's see. So I'm going to manually construct a linear gradient here. And I'll just demonstrate how you do it. So you can think of a linear gradient as, let's just do it with 20 thread stripes. And that is not quite going to work, but it's close enough. Okay. So you can think of a linear gradient as being, sorry, I'm trying to think and talk at the same time. You can think of a linear gradient as basically being stripes of different proportions of color. And so I'm going to okay, actually, let me do this again. 10 threads. Okay, so no, actually, I'm okay. So this will be a not quite balanced linear gradient, but because I wanted to center it. But basically what you want to do is start on one end with pure color A. And let's just say that pure color, we're going to go between purple and turquoise. And so you start on one end with pure purple here. And then you have another section that's going to be, let's say, 3, 2, 1. Yeah, okay. So you start on one section that is 3 parts purple and 1 part turquoise, which I'm going to speed up by using alternating stripes. So now I'm constructing something that is 3 parts purple, 2, 1. Yeah. And so now this is 1 stripe of turquoise, 3 stripes of purple, 1 stripe of turquoise, so it's 3 to 1. And then you'd create another stripe that is 2 to 1. And we do here to here, and it's not a linear gradient, it's alternating stripes. And 2 to 1, save colors. The borders on this are not quite right because it should be, and when I talked about how to do it manually, I pointed out that you would have to jiggle the colors. If I were doing this not in a demo, I would go back and jiggle the edges so that they looked a little bit better. But so the idea with the linear gradient is that you're going from 3 to 1 to 2 to 1 to 1 to 1. And that is what's creating your linear gradient. So you're basically doing stripes that alternate the different proportions of colors. And so now we're doing another section that is alternating stripes, 1 to 2. That is, and now we're gradually moving in the other direction. And now we are going to alternate stripes, 1, 2, 3 colors. And now we're done with the gradient. I just had a couple of extra threads on the other side. And so that's the principle behind the linear gradient. This one, like I said, the edges look funny because in general, you want to mess with the, you want to jiggle the edges so that it looks right, and the edges here didn't quite get jiggled accurately. But that's the principle of the linear gradient. You are taking sections of each proportion and lining them up in stripes. So that's how the linear gradient gets constructed. Okay, let's see. So that's the linear gradients, designing with linear gradients. We talked about creating subtle gradients versus dramatic ones. And we talked about the ways that colors contrast. Oh, right. So telling the value of a color, taking a picture of the yarns in black and white is generally pretty accurate. The only problem is that a lot of digital cameras don't deal well with red, blue, and yellow, which is unfortunate since we're using a lot of those colors. Something that can happen is that red comes out really dark and black comes out really dark and yellow comes out as white. And so if that's what's happening in your photos, what you want to do is use a yarn twist. And so this is also out of my class, Make Your Colors Sing. But basically with a yarn twist, what you do is you take 2 strands of the yarn and you just twist them together. And if the resulting yarn looks like a solid color, like it does here, then you have low contrast between the yarns. And if the resulting yarn looks like this, let me zoom in a bit. There we go. And scroll down. If the resulting yarn looks like this, where you have kind of a barber pole look, although that rather dates me, if it has a marl yarn look, then you do have high contrast between the 2 yarns. So that's a yarn twist. Somebody asked what I meant when I said jiggle the edges. All I meant by that was that, where's my linear gradient? You can see how here there's a big jump in between. When I say here, I mean right here. There is a big jump between a big patch of purple in between the proportion here and the proportion here. So you kind of when you're constructing a linear gradient by hand, you kind of have to massage the edges so that there isn't a big gap in colors in between. Okay. So, and let's see. That was that. Then what else is there in linear gradients, just to make sure I didn't miss anything? Oh, so the gradient scale. Let me just demonstrate how this and scale and unit size. We talked about that. Okay, so let me just demo scale and unit size. So the idea behind scale, let's do a linear gradient. Select all warp. And let's size this up a bit. So we're going to do a linear gradient. And we're going to do, let's pick 2 colors. Okay, so the idea with scale is that basically just that it's changing the rate at which the colors change. So here, actually, let's do black and white. So here the colors are changing very rapidly. So you're changing the proportion of black to white very quickly from lots of black and only a little white to about an even amount to suddenly lots of white and only a little black. Whereas down here, the proportion is about 3 to 1 black to white, and then for quite a while, and then it changes slowly to 2 to 1 black to white, and then it changes to 1 to 1 black to white, and so on and so forth. But the proportion stays relatively stable. Whereas if you crank the scale all the way up this way, then it changes from something like 8 to 1 black to white all the way down to 1 to 1 over the same period of time. So it has to do with how gradually the colors are changing. Now, the thing with threading unit is that threading unit is changing the size of the thickness of the lines. And so you really only want to crank up threading unit if you want the lines to be bolder, if you want to emphasize the size of, if basically you want to crank up threading unit for one of 2 reasons. One, if you want to avoid railroading, and 2, if you want to emphasize the pattern of the lines. Because when you crank up threading unit, it cranks up the thickness of the lines. And cranking up the thickness of the lines means that there will be less visual blending. The pattern will become more bold. So that's basically that as far as designing the linear gradient goes. If you want the linear gradient to become more subtle, the other thing to do is, of course, to pick colors that are closer to each other, both on the color wheel, but more importantly in value. So if you look at these shades of brown, they're all brown. But if you pick 2 shades of brown that are very different in value, then you get a much bolder gradient. So one other thing to keep in mind is that if you are, I know I'm throwing out a lot of different things pretty quickly, is that if you're using a light weft, it will tend to show, it will tend to emphasize, sorry, a dark weft will tend to emphasize differences in value a lot more and show contrast a lot more than a light weft will. A light weft will tend to bleach out the differences. Okay. Curved gradients. I am needing to go faster. Okay. So curved gradients are basically designed to look like a 3-dimensional curve in the fabric. And curved gradients, if you look at a cylinder with a light looking straight on it, it has symmetric shading from right to left. And so if you were to look at this, the light would be striking at it from basically it. This is what a cylinder looks like when you have a headlamp on your forehead and the light is striking it straight on like that. And so the curve gradient mimics this shading by creating an alternating thread gradient that's lighter in the center, darker at the edges, and with shading that changes basically lighter in the center and then drops off rapidly to a darker color at the edges. So if you look at that cylinder and if you look at that curve gradient, that's what you see. Now you can do other curves too, but basically because threads have thickness, and unless you're working in super fine threads, I found it very difficult to do anything more complicated with threads that are, thinner than 6's2 silk. So basically the way you generate the curve is by taking a cylinder and reducing it to stripes and then trying to approximate the stripes. Or else you can do it in Photoshop, and I'm not even going to try to explain how that works. Now let's see. Now you want to use lighter colors in the center and darker colors on the edges, and the reason why has to do with how the gradient is lit. Now here it is in Photoshop, and again, if the light is sitting at here, it's lighter on the inside and darker on the outside. And if you were to invert that, now because you're seeing the top of the cylinder here, you're still seeing, your brain is still telling you it's a cylinder. If I were to get rid of the top of this cylinder, which I am not quite sure how I would do, let's see what happens if I invert this entire thing, actually. Okay, so if I were to get rid of this part, let's see if I can. Oh, right, wrong one. Sure, hold on. Okay, let's try that again. Okay, so now that we're looking at it, and it looks the opposite way around. It looks kind of like a cylinder still, but it looks like a cylinder that's lit from either side. And it's really, really hard to convince yourself that it's an inverted curve. So if you try inverting it so that's dark on the outside, on the inside, and lighter on the edges, it doesn't look like an inverted curve to the eye. It just kind of looks wrong. If I were to, part of the problem right now is that you're getting cues from the rest of the piece that says that it's a curve. Let's see. Okay, so if I were to show you this, your brain wouldn't think it was a curve. Whereas if I were to do this, your brain is still thinking that this is a curve. Once you invert it, then your brain is not interpreting it as a curve in the opposite direction. It's just not quite sure what it is because the shading and the lighting is wrong. So the illusion doesn't really work very well with darker colors on the inside and lighter colors on the outside. So let's see. Because that whole illusion depends on the value contrast, depends on the shading, you want to use colors with high value contrast. And so in this one example, you can see that using yellow and purple, which have very high value contrast, here you're starting out with a light color and you're shading off to a dark color. Here you're starting off with a dark color and you're shading off to something that's about the same value. And so the fabric looks flat. There's no change in value, and to create that illusion of curve. Again, what you need in order to make it look three-dimensional is that shading down at the edges. So The gradient scale is something similar where it changes the depth of the curve. Here, with a large scale gradient, you're seeing rapid change near the edge, which is what creates that illusion of curve. And then over here, you're not seeing much rapid change near the edge. And so the eye is interpreting that as a very shallow curve. It has to do with how fast the edge falls off into shadow. Threading unit, like we've discussed before, just has to do with how prominent the lines are. And with, let's see, oops, hold on. With curved gradients, sometimes, okay, with curved gradients, you get more shading if you get better shading if you are working with single thread units. But you also get more defined lines and sort of a stronger looking curve sometimes if you are, let me put this in on a dark background. It's easier to see. And here you're getting railroading again because I used a dark weft and the lines are dark. So let me put it with a slightly lighter weft to reduce the railroading. But if you change this, I happen to prefer curved gradients, and this is just my taste, with a threading unit of 2 because the lines are a little bolder. And so it looks to me a little more curved with the lines a little more bold. So, but the shading is not as smooth. And we talked about railroading. So multiple colors, basically what this is doing is adding to the shading. You can do it in monochrome, like over here, but basically what you're doing is you're taking that, your multiple colors, and you're just giving the impression that there's more falling off into shadow at the sides by adding shading in the other colors. And that is basically curved gradients. I don't have an example of a woven inverted curve. There were actually quite a few of them in Discover Gradients. So if you hop on over to the Weaving with Ken and Janet Facebook group, then you can find a bunch of examples there. Okay, Fibonacci fade. The Fibonacci fade gradient is basically a series, you can think of it as a sequence of alternating stripes that are bigger at one end and smaller at the other end. The main difference between the Fibonacci fade and the linear gradient is that not in the linear gradient, all the stripes of the opposing color are single thread stripes. And in the Fibonacci fade, they are not. There are multiple threads. And so the Fibonacci fade is sort of more visually interesting than the linear gradient is. It is more of a pattern than the linear gradient is. So the size of the stripes changes in each direction. The general principle of working with Fibonacci fades is that, well, you can make them either subtle or strong. And so here you have an example where in some areas it's a fairly subtle design. So like between the orange here and the red here, this is a fairly subtle transition because the colors are very similar. Between the yellow and the orange, then it's a much less subtle transition, and this pattern stands forth a lot more boldly than in the other areas because there's more of a value contrast. So you can use it either as a decorative, like somewhere down here. Nope, it's in the next lesson. But so it's it's pretty versatile because you can either use it as a design element in itself, or you can use it to transition colors in a slightly more interesting way than the linear gradient, which is good for when you want to transition colors with, absolutely seamlessly. In terms of how it's constructed, basically what you do is you go right to left in one Fibonacci sequence and left to right in another Fibonacci sequence, and you just kind of interleave them. So if you look at, so the Fibonacci sequence you get by taking one, adding one to it, and then you add 1 and 1, you get 2, you add 1 and 2, and you get 3. And then you basically take the two numbers, the last two numbers of the sequence, and then you add them, and that gives you the next number in the sequence. So here you have 1 and 2 give you 3. Then you have the last two numbers are 2 and 3. You add them together, that gives you 5. And then you would add 3 and 5 together, and that gives you 8. And then you've had 5 and 8, and that gives you 13, and so on and so forth. And basically what you do is you decide how many Fibonacci numbers you're going to use. In this case, we're using 5 of them. 1, 1, 2, 3, and 5. And you just line them up, and you put 1 here and the last one of the other sequence here, 2 here, the second to last one of the other sequence here, 3, which is the middle one of the other sequence, and so on and so forth. So that's basically all there is to the Fibonacci fade. Now, if you want to design a Fibonacci fade with scale of 2, you just repeat each pair of stripes twice. And so that's how it's constructed. Now, in terms of designing with it, the main difference between the Fibonacci fade and the linear or curved gradient is that you're always using thicker stripes in a bunch of the gradient. And so it produces a design that has higher contrast than the linear gradient does. And so that's handy when you want to create a visible pattern in the piece. So if you want and it's a nice compromise between having a smooth transition and having a highly visible transition. So you can think of it as being kind of in between the curved gradient, which relies on having high contrast, and the linear gradient, which is almost designed to have a smooth transition. So with Fibonacci fade, you can kind of go one direction or the other direction in terms of having a bold gradient or a smooth gradient. And so if you want it to be bold, then you use two strongly contrasting colors that contrast strongly in value and or hue, mostly in value. So here you have dark blue and yellow, which is about as strong a contrast as you can get. Or if you want a smoother gradient, then of course you can use two very similar colors. Here I have used dark purple and dark blue, and you can barely tell the two colors apart. Okay, so that is value and hue, which we already talked about. Saturation. The gradient scale, basically, if this is a little bit counterintuitive, but if you increase the gradient scale, it actually reduces the size of the lines. So small scale gradient means larger stripes, and big scale gradient equals smaller stripes. So I just gave two examples of how to use Fibonacci fade with multiple colors. There are a lot of other ways you can do it. And I wanted to demo using marker lines. And so let me explain actually in this one, the idea of marker threads. I'm not actually going to create the Fibonacci fade just because we don't have time for me to do all the exercises. But the basic idea of marker threads is to help you lay out your design. Because here's the thing, if you're trying to do a gradient and you want to do your gradient across 48 threads, it's a real drag to click gradients and then have to sort of sit there and peer up at the screen and say, wait, I wanted to put my gradient right here. And how do I count 48 threads from here to here? And is this exactly where I wanted to put it? And, at this point, you're sort of hovering with the mouse and your fingers are getting tired and you're trying to figure it out. And the whole thing is kind of miserable. And so marker threads are a way to avoid all of that, because what you can do is you can zoom way in on the screen and say, okay, I want to put my marker thread, I want to put my gradient between this exact thread right here. And then you can count or do whatever you're going to do. Look at the numbers, the thread counts in red, decide that you're going to put it exactly between this thread and that thread. And then when you've actually figured everything out, then you hit gradients and select just between this marker thread and that marker thread, and it's all easy as pie. And so that's basically why you want to use marker threads. It wasn't really obvious in the instructions, but so I wanted to explain, why you would want to do that. So let's see, that's the Fibonacci. And I have 18 minutes left, so I'm going to dive straight into striped gradients. Now, the thing with striped gradients is that striped gradients are actually the most powerful kind of gradient, because if you think about it, pretty much all gradients are striped gradients if you're willing to construct them one by one. And striped gradients in twills don't sound as interesting. When you get to doing more complex drafts, striped gradients turn out to be the most useful type of gradient, because they give you the finest control over the placement of the threads. And when you're dealing with more complex drafts, that turns out to be extremely, extremely useful, because suddenly you have to coordinate your color transitions and your gradient with the edges of your draft. So if you look at this particular striped gradient here, this striped gradient has the color changes coordinated with the edges of different parts of this blooming leaf draft. And that's super important for not, carving up your draft. In twill and plain weave, that's less useful. But if you want to, do interesting things like this design is actually a repeating design that has a little crescendo effect, because the white parts or the light brown parts keep getting bigger. And so it has a rhythm to it that you don't get with the other kinds of gradients so much. And so striped gradients, because you're creating it by hand and crafting each section by hand, give you a kind of fine motor control that you don't get with the other type of gradients, because you're not using a gradient generator. And so even though they're more of a pain to create and they require more colors and so on and so forth, I have a soft spot for striped gradients. There's a lot more to them, and they're a lot more sophisticated, and they have a lot more potential than what you usually see, which is just, the sort of color gamp. And I mean, it's not that this isn't pretty, but this isn't everything that you can do with the striped gamp. By any means. And these are just very simple examples of striped gamps, but there's just so many things that you can do with stripes that I'm sorry I don't have more examples, because I've seen some just absolutely spectacular things that you can do with stripes. I do encourage you to explore this a little more. This is basically just teaching you how to use marker threads to make designing symmetrical striped gradients a little bit easier. This exercise over here is explaining about using alternating stripes to soften color transitions. And I don't think I have anything prepared on that. But basically the idea here is that if you have a limited range of colors, you can use alternating threads to kind of average out the colors. And I'm not going to go into that because I do want to save a little bit of time for this. So plain weave versus twill. So basically, if you have a rigid heddle loom and you're not weaving with 3 heddles, if you are weaving with 3 heddles, you know who you are. But if you're not weaving with 3 heddles, then you're going to be using plain weave because that's what rigid heddles do, and they do it beautifully. If you are on a shaft loom, then there are a couple of things you want to think about. One is, do you want it to look the same on both sides? If you want it to look the same on both sides, then you want to use plain weave. So here is an example. I don't remember if I put this one into the class or not, but on the left you have plain weave, and on the right you have 1-3 twill and 3-1 twill sides, and they are different. In fact, they look quite different. Now, this actually has more ghosting, which is to say the pattern shows the 3-1 twill pattern shows more clearly. The warp pattern shows more clearly on the 1-3 twill side than you would normally expect, because the yellow is such a dominant color. If I had not used yellow in the center part, then you might see actually even less of this color than you would expect. But you can see that on the left you have plain weave, and this would look the same on both sides, which is why I've only shown one side of it. But these are the exact same color patterns, and you can see how the warp and weft stripes show clearly on both sides of the plain weave. Whereas if you look at the 1-3 and the 3-1 twill, the two sides look very different. So on one side, you mostly see twill stripes, and you kind of see these ghostly warp stripes. And on the other side, you see pretty much all warp stripes and very little of the twills of the weft stripes. And so that's definitely something you want to keep in mind. If you want it to look the same on both sides, then you want to use the plain weave. And if you want the possibility of having 2 different designs on 2 different sides, then you want to go with the twill. Now, that's what it looks like on paper. If you want to see what it looks like in practice, here is a piece. And I know I told you all to stick with the same, with just one type of gradient, but here's one that's done with 2 different types of gradients. This is a multicolored curve on one side, and I think this is a linear gradient on the other side. And so again, you see the prominent warp gradient on one side and the prominent weft gradient on the other side. But when you actually wear this thing, you've got a bazillion different ways that you can wear it. Let's see here. So here's one way to wear it. So in this case, it's been folded in half, and all you're really seeing is the weft gradient. In this case, it's being worn half folded over, so you're seeing half the warp gradient and half the weft gradient. And of course, you could flip it over and the other way and only see the warp gradient. So if you have something that is a twill, you can have essentially 3 or 4 different ways that you can wear this cowl. This has the weft fringe on it, which we'll be getting into in a little bit too, if you want to weave it with weft fringe. So if you want to, now the downside is that you get to have either warp or weft pattern on both sides, but you don't get the interaction of warp and weft. Now, if you want the color to remain bright over the entire fabric, then picking 3-1 twill is probably a better choice. And so if you look at, oops, sorry, wrong one. Here, let's maximize that. So a lot of these colors blend into duller colors. If you look at the plain weave, you can kind of see that. So here you have in the center section, you have the yellow and the blue kind of blending into a grayish color. Whereas in the twill version, the colors stay relatively separate and you have the sort of yellow or yellow green on dominant on one side and the blue dominant on the other side, and they stay relatively separate. And they look brighter than in the center where they're kind of mixing into a little bit of mush. Now, so you have to worry more about blending in plain weave than you do in the twills, because 3-1 twill and 1-3 twill are separating drafts and they don't blend colors together. Well, warp and weft colors. Now, how much that really matters is another question. And we'll get into that next week as well. But basically, if you're, I talk a lot about the two primary rule in my other classes, and it does matter. But with gradients, it matters less. And the reason is that your eye likes to look at bright colors. And so if your cloth is bright in some areas and not bright in other areas, the eye will tend to look at areas where the cloth is bright and ignore the areas where the cloth is dull. So if there are areas, so in this particular piece of cloth, you've got a lot of areas where the cloth is actually pretty muddy, like right here, for example. If this were all that there was to the gradient, then your cloth would look pretty muddy. And some people would like that, but most people probably wouldn't. But the fact that you've got all these other bright colors in here, what's happening is that your eye is going, oh, look, pretty, yellow. Oh, look, red. Let's go look at that yellow and let's go look at that red. And it's totally ignoring all the duller colors. And so even though you get duller colors, if something, if more than about a third or a half of your colors are the brighter colors, your eye won't notice the duller colors. And so if you're, let me try and get back to where I was. So if you're okay with some duller colors, either twill or plain weave will be fine. If you want your warp and weft colors to have equal influence, then of course you want plain weave. In 3-1 twill, your warp and weft colors one of them is going to dominate one side and the other one of them is going to dominate the other side. Here you have basically a green side and a blue side. And here you have a blended side because you have the plain weave is blended colors and the 1-3 twill is the green side and 3-1 twill is the blue side. Let's see here. And then in terms of heaviness and drape, twill produces a heavier fabric, but it's drapier than the plain weave. And that kind of covers the twill and plain weave. I think I covered most of the differences between the two when I was talking about those things. Yeah. Okay, so we have 7 minutes. So let me see if I can blitz through some questions.
I have a couple here for you. Do you by any chance have a woven example of an inverted curve gradient?
I don't, but if you go to the
Yeah, she doesn't have Facebook, unfortunately.
Oh, okay. Not off the top of my head. But if you go to the yeah, I don't have it off the top of my head. They are in the Facebook group. There might be some in the in-course community, but I'm not sure. Okay, Chris Pagona, you might have answered this already. Would the alternating thread gradient look as smooth if it wasn't in twill? It might look as smooth. It would depend on the weft color.
Okay,
In plain weave, the weft has a lot more impact than in a 3-1 twill, which is warp dominant.
great. Lorraine wants to confirm what she heard in design principles. She heard contrast as far as value and hue, scale, consideration about the acceptability of plain weave, possible effects of railroading and log cabin, and also the type of gradient. Did you get it?
Yep, that was it.
Well done. How about more detail on crescendo gradients?
I don't remember what I was talking about with crescendo gradients. Or I don't remember when I mentioned crescendo gradients.
I didn't hear that.
So I'm not entirely sure.
Okay. Cloud 70 wants to know if you can use 3 colors in a linear gradient when using the 5-1, etc. proportions. I think that's 5 threads, 1 thread of each.
Linear gradients are 2-color gradients. So you can't use 3 colors in them.
Excellent.
2-2 twill, 2-2 twill works is the same on both sides, except that the line, the direction of the line flips. They, in like plain weave, it blends colors together. It just doesn't blend them quite as much as plain weave. The reason we aren't really covering it in this class is that it behaves a lot like plain weave, except of course that it produces a twill density fabric.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Debbie wants to do a double gradient, but has not been able to in twill. Does it depend on the type of gradient?
You should be able to do a double gradient in twill. The main thing is that one side is going to be warp dominant, the other side is going to be weft dominant. So you may not be seeing your weft gradient until you click the view reverse side, the view opposite side checkbox.
Okay, great. Now we have 2 very important questions here. I've got clarity on the crescendo question. You talked about it when you were doing the brown stripes.
Okay. Yes. Now I
forgot that part.
And then, okay. So let me go back and talk about that very briefly. And then I see that everybody wants to know about Michelle's scarf.
Well, that was the next question, but I figured we'd get the crescendo gradient out of the way first.
Right. So that was under striped gradients.
Yep.
All I really meant to say with that one is that this one feels a little bit like a visual crescendo because the tan stripes are getting louder and louder and louder and louder as you're going from left to right. And so it's creating kind of a visual crescendo. And so you can do effects like that with striped gradients. And of course, this is being done in monochrome, but there's no reason you couldn't do this around the color wheel or do some other effect with it. And so my point with this is that you can do designs with striped gradients that you can't do with any other kind of gradient. And you have a fineness of control over striped gradients that you don't have with any other kind of gradient. And now I'll shut up and let Michelle talk about her scarf.
You're muted, Michelle.
Yep. This scarf it illustrates so many of the things that Tiana has talked about. Because it is 20s2, you get blending that's a lot more even than it would have been if it was a larger thread. It is the 20 colors around the rainbow in the original GAMP, and then it's been woven with all of the tints and tones and sort of a value gradient. And I don't know if you can see it, but it's an amazing 8-shaft twill. And it's interesting because it looks like diamonds when it's woven this way. I've woven it with the color breaks in the opposite part and they look like circles. So it was designed by Mary Barrett and I love it. It keeps me nice and warm. So
very, very, very
cold
pretty.
in Idaho.
So. Are you already cold?
Yes, I'm always
Oh.
cold.
Here's the Fritz.
Oh,
Oh, we got the
Fritz.
cat.
Fritz
Holy
makes a
cow, it's
cameo at the
Tom.
end of every webinar.
Oh, good. We miss
It ain't
Fritz.
over until the cat shows up.
No, that's true. Let me save the chat here and see what questions we
All
just
right.
got dropped in. Is there a place to find that pattern in Michelle's scarf or for Michelle's scarf?
It's in one of our kits on the website. I am afraid right off the top of my head, I don't remember which one. I'll try and post that in the Facebook group and have the exact location for it when we do our thing on Wednesday.
Okay.
Cool.
Okay. It is a 64 thread repeat. It's kind of a lot of fun. And now that we've done this, I'm thinking I may try and do a fade within each color strip. I have thoughts. Some interesting things to do with this. So
Let's see. Marianne Drake's asking, what do you do with the marker threads when building your gradients? That's described in all of the exercises. They are there to sort
They're
of
basically there to help you figure out where to put your gradients. So,
Alrighty then.
grayscale for weft, basically you can use it as another gradient. So I think that's basically it. Or are there other questions?
Lorraine wants to know, what was our assignment this week? Just choose.
The assignment for this week is to design your warp.
And on a rigid heddle, would it be better to weave 24 ends per inch 2 heddles or double thread 12 EPI and bundle in pairs?
I am supporting 12 EPI bundled in pairs on the rigid heddle. If you want 24, that's a shaft loom pattern. So I've said before, I don't do multiple rigid heddle weaving. So.
Okay,
Perfect.
great. All right. Thank you, everybody. We are having a color editor. We're having a live color editor Q&A tomorrow. So if you have questions about the color editor, then come and ask your questions there. If not, we will see you on Wednesday for the live Q&A session.
And yes, tomorrow will be taped.
Yep.
12 to 1:30 Pacific time.
Thank you, Dawn. You got all the questions? Got all
I
the chat?
do. I'm all set. Yep.
Okay, great. Okay.